the RSNA, this is the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. My name is Paul Gee, and I'm a radiologist at the University of Maryland and co-host of the podcast.
And my name is Tenjani, and I'm a radiology resident at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center and co-host of the podcast. Each month, we dive into the hottest topics in radiology AI and talk with leading experts, thought leaders, and movers and shakers in the field.
Welcome back to the Radiology AI Podcast. In this episode, we continue our conversation with Dr. Jeremias Sulam and Jacopo Teneggi about Jacopo's research and collaborating in a multidisciplinary lab. Learn more about our co-host Dr. Paul Yee's experience working with Dr. Jeremias Sulam and Jacopo on projects across the spectrum of imaging AI.
And so, Jer, I know that you and Paul have been working together for quite a bit now, and again, the collaboration has yielded some just fantastic work that's really helped push our field further and inspired new ideas and opened doors for our field in terms of how we approach imaging AI and some of the challenges. So how long have you both been working together, and how did that multidisciplinary group come together?
Yes, so you're correct. I've been, at least personally, very fortunate in having been working with Paul for the last 2 or 3 years. We actually got to know each other in the beginning of the COVID pandemic in the beginning of 2020, as this rather large multidisciplinary group was being put together at Hopkins to address some of the problems that we were seeing rising with the onset of the pandemic. Eventually, for a number of reasons, that workforce didn't lead to much, but it was very clear from talking with Paul that I personally felt that I had a lot of questions that he could answer. And I think that perhaps was mutual to some extent. He had some questions in methodology that perhaps I could contribute to. And very naturally, these led to us just bouncing questions and answers off of each other, and then eventually leading to a number of projects that we have continued to grow ever since.
Feelings mutual. I've benefited tremendously. And as Jeremias said, it was during the pandemic. Fun fact, Jeremias and I had not ever met in person until about a year, maybe a year and some change into the pandemic. And so that was a fun thing once we all got vaccinated and got to meet each other on campus. But yeah, no, I want to echo what he said. I always felt like as a radiologist, I kind of had a foot out the door from the clinical setting in a pure clinical kind of place, but had a lot of questions about some of the engineering, some of the techniques that I had been seeing in the computer science world and the engineering world. And when I met Jeremias, it was really refreshing because, I felt like when I asked questions, he was able to understand. And it's probably maybe a little bit, I'd assume, of the biomedical engineering background that he comes from, where, when I talked to Jeremias, he's had training and education in anatomy and physiology. So when I talk about certain things, he's able to understand what I'm bringing to the table. And I think likewise, when he brings things to the table, I hope that I'm able to translate it in a way that makes sense. And so it's been a tremendous amount of fun working together. I think it's been pretty productive, and I just see it hopefully continuing for years to come.
And so I'm really inspired by that, because I think that, and personally, this is just my opinion, that when we endeavor on projects related to imaging AI, I really feel like we need representation from all these domains. We need all the stakeholders on the team to see those perspectives. But that's just not the case in every setting. And I can imagine some challenges, but are there any that you've encountered in your experience that you think you have advice for our listeners who are trying to get these multidisciplinary groups together? I think it's very common. Well, I shouldn't say very common, but I think it is common for maybe having a clinical radiologist who has a background in computer science, and maybe they code and maybe they've created some algorithms, but how can we facilitate this actual multidisciplinary group where you have domain experts in each of these settings?
I think it's challenging, just, from my perspective from the MD side. When you think about the average academic radiologist, I think most of us have interest in research, but the reality is we get paid for our clinical work. It's literally what gives us our paychecks. It keeps the hospital running, both from a financial as well as a human health standpoint. So because of that, I think research, it often becomes a nice to have, but not a need to have. I know that during my training, it was challenging and sometimes frustrating when I really wanted to work on research, but I'd be on nights for 7 nights straight. I wouldn't have the time nor the energy to really contribute in the ways that I wanted to, even if I had really willing and able engineering colleagues. But I think also one thing I noticed is that, even the term research, it's pretty different depending on who you ask. Things that we as clinicians consider research may not be considered research to our engineering colleagues. I'll give you a case in point. When I first started working with some of the computer science faculty at Hopkins, where I did my radiology training, I would be saying, hey, we want to do research. We want to apply this deep learning model to diagnosing this type of tumor or diagnosing this type of injury. And what they would say to me is, well, that's more engineering. That's not really research. And I'd be like, what's the difference? And so for them, things like that, where we apply methods that have already been developed, that's often seen as like, hey, we're engineering, we're applying it. It's sort of like, hey, you got a nail, we'll put a hammer to it. Whereas research often is, how do we develop methods that are going to push the envelope from a technical standpoint? And so I think that's something that I've learned over the years. It may not be apply in every case, but it's definitely differences in maybe philosophies as well as incentives, I think, that are challenging. As to what could solve that, I think it's tough. I think departments that are committed to building physician scientists really have to put their money where their mouth is. We look at things like support of career development awards. Those are really awesome. I think from the RSNA, the AUR, the Rankin Ray Society, they protect time for faculty. But the reality is too, the departments have to put in some financial investment into that to cover the salaries, to provide maybe startup funding to hire research staff. So that's all to say, I don't have the answers, but I think those are some of the challenges I've seen. But I think some solutions are definitely being led by groups like the RSNA.
I think having the solution comes from first knowing the challenges. So thank you for enumerating those. Jared, what do you think?
So it's interesting when I was hearing to Paul talk, because I think from my perspective, things have been different in the following sense. For us, because we don't have the clinical component to the work that we do, most of it is centered around research. And so research is always present and we're always thinking about research. So in light of that, then what would be the benefit for someone who perhaps is more computer science minded and thinks about methods rather than specific problems? What is the benefit to someone like that in talking to someone like Paul? I think the benefit is just drastic. It's huge. It's extremely important, even when one is doing work that is not necessarily 100% committed to a specific problem. It's extremely important to talk to domain experts, and in this case, people who have tight contact with the clinical practice, to really understand what the bottlenecks of their pipelines are, to really understand what are the main challenges that they face. It's happened numerous times that sometimes I would say something and then Paul would stop me and stressing how non-trivial that was perhaps for him and for the community that he is in. And the same thing has happened the other way around. Sometimes he would tell me about something that is extremely common and that happens extremely often. And I would be surprised out of my seat because I just never stopped to thought that could happen, or I just did not know that was a thing. And so being open to talk to people who are, immediately outside of your comfort zone has this very nice effect of training you to be flexible, to understand broader opinions and broader questions. And then inevitably that leads to just very cool research projects and very fun times.
And Jacopo, you're coming from a different perspective here. So as a PhD candidate, is there anything different that you're seeing, maybe in terms of interactions with other trainees, or maybe it's similar to what Jared and Paul have mentioned?
First of all, still student, not yet a candidate. but we'll work towards that. No, jokes aside, yes. So as I said earlier, I'm BME by training, but then decided to move into CS because I guess the way that I felt was that to really have an effect, an impact, like doing meaningful research in this field, it is fundamental that one is able to grasp deeply all of these different aspects that make up what we're talking about in radiology and healthcare. And it's like it's such a big thing that no single perspective can really picture it in a fair representation, right? And for my experience at Hopkins, what I can say, it's just that it's the best environment because everything is just so intertwined and departments collaborate so much and institutes, and there's the hospital and clinicians, and you can basically talk and bump ideas off with whoever is the expert for that specific thing. And I really think there's no other way to pushing the field forward other than taking the time and learning all these things that you need to know.
Absolutely. And I think on the note of maintaining this open communication and having collaborations, I do want to talk about one more exciting work that came from this collaboration. So this is from Radiology Artificial Intelligence back in August of 2022, not too long ago. So a paper titled Code and Data Sharing Practices in the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Literature, a meta-research study. So Paul and Jared, tell us more about what we've learned from looking at the rates of code and data sharing, and specifically, what's the current status? Has anything changed in the field since you published this, in my opinion, eye-opening take on just the need for open source code, increased transparency to encourage reproducibility and collaboration? Paul, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I realize I'm playing double duty as host and I guess pseudo guest here. Yeah, this paper is another example of the collaboration I think happens when you work with people with complementary expertises. This actually came about because Jeremias and I were working with a undergrad working with us, and he was trying to implement some code that came from an article published in one of the RSNA journals. And as you know, Ali, in the editorial board, we talk a lot about reproducibility, about transparency, needing to create repositories where people can actually build on the science of the code that's being used rather than just saying, hey, we built the AI and look what it did. But what we found was that even though code was shared, it really wasn't in a form that was very easy to implement. Long story short, the student had to kind of recode things from scratch, take bits and pieces, but really kind of do things from the ground up. And so that led us to ask, just out of a question, I wonder how often this code is actually documented well. I know from the editorial side, a lot of times papers come in and they say code will be released upon publication, but I always felt like that's a little bit of a potentially problematic thing because once a paper is published, how much of an incentive is there? I think people can be well-intentioned, but I think reality is life gets busy. And so, things take priority, and I can easily see something like sharing code falling to the bottom of things in the midst of grant deadlines, active projects, et cetera. And so we reviewed articles in the RSNA journal suite across all of the major journals, radiology, radiology AI, cardiothoracic imaging, imaging cancer. And we asked two questions. One, how often was code shared? And number two, when they did share code, how often was it reproducible? Meaning, was it adequately documented for someone to reasonably implement it? And we found about a third of AI papers shared code. So, most of them did not share code. And of the ones that did share code, only about a third of those actually were reproducible. And so we thought that was pretty striking, but I think consistent with some of our experience that code is shared infrequently, and there's room for improvement. I think that a lot of this though isn't necessarily intentional. Part of it is for us, right? We're radiologists. This is a new kind of research. I remember about a couple years ago, the radiology editorial board, they actually had to or they actually released an editorial guidelines for how should AI projects be documented, because they were experiencing this kind of wave of AI papers, and they realized, wow, this is a new frontier for us. We're not used to reviewing papers with code. We're not used to reviewing papers in this domain. And then shortly after, as you know, Chuck Kahn, Linda Moy, and John Mongan released the claim checklist, which I think for a lot of journals, including ours, has become a best practices standard checklist for AI methodology reporting. And so I think that one of the encouraging things from our paper was that rate of code sharing and reproducibility did increase over the years. So I think that we have room to improve, but I think we've got upward trends, and I anticipate it's just going to get better and better. But it's a little bit of the background and some of my thoughts. Jacopo, Jeremias, I'm curious from your end though. When I talk to you about this, I know that code sharing and in general just being very open about work, whether it's through preprint servers or repositories like Papers with Code, it seems like it's pretty standard practice. Like it would be unthinkable to publish a paper without sharing code that's documented well. So I'm curious, what's the attitude or perspectives from your side? Is it almost seen like if you don't do this, something's wrong? Because I think on our end, it's not necessarily that way.
I personally don't know. I don't want to speak for what people's impressions are whenever they see a paper that doesn't have code. I do think that it is certainly true that over the last 5 to 10 years, in computer science more broadly, there's been a steady increase in the number of papers sharing as much as possible their experimental framework, and that often includes code and when possible, data as well. And by now, the amount of papers reporting and making code available has continued to increase and is by now a standard practice. I should say, though, that didn't happen entirely just by chance. And what I mean by this is that a lot of the bigger publishing venues, and in particular, if you look at the machine learning conferences, they have been in the last 3-4 years very careful in documenting what papers did include code. They have been encouraging reviewers to make specific notes of this. And so there's been this sort of organically organized consensus as to the need for require this for publication. And reviewers, in the end of the day, do evaluate different contribution that includes all details about the methodology, which nowadays also includes code. Certainly, I don't think in this environment we sort of need to convince ourselves of the benefits of doing this. It just facilitates reproducibility. It facilitates finding flaws about potential papers or potential hypotheses and ideas. It just facilitates developing even better ideas forward. So I think it's a useful exercise to remind ourselves that publishing venues and professional organizations have to do this proactively, have to increasingly make sure that all I's are dotted and all T's are crossed. And my understanding from my conversations with Paul and others at the RSNA is that this is an increasing concern, and indeed more and more efforts go into making sure that these things are done the proper way.
So as we wrap up here in our conversation, what are some of the remaining problems at the intersection of machine learning and diagnostic imaging? What should we look forward to, and what's something that our audience can take a stab at on their own end with their own research? Jerry, Jacopo?
Well, something that I've been interested in recently, I think, and parts of my research and things that we use in the paper presented at the RSNA is that there's so much more to just having a model when you talk about healthcare and radiology. For example, interpretability and trustworthiness and fairness are fundamental aspects of machine learning for radiology or healthcare that are not necessarily applicable to the same extent in other fields where machine learning may be more broadly deployed in the wild already. So those are definitely questions, and we have other people in the lab, Beeple Barty, who's working on these aspects of fairness. So how to make sure that, demographics change, and how does the performance of your model change with the demographics? Like, how do you know you're not systematically underserving, underrepresented demographics in your model? Whatever bias was in your data, it's probably in your model, but we don't know all the bias that is in the data. Another aspect is uncertainty quantification. So, how to make sure that your model may decide not to say anything if it's not completely confident about the prediction, right? Right now, we just have these black boxes. You throw an image in, you get an answer. It's not like if I didn't input an image of a cat on a model trained on x-rays, I wouldn't get an answer, right? Probably this model should have some fail-safe system that says, no, 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 this is not something I should be predicting on. And in general, how to turn these models into reliable engineering tools that we are confident in using every day. That I think there's still a lot to go to have that level of reliability and safety for ML in healthcare.
I think I need to rethink myself in my role of advisor of Jacopo, because he clearly understands some of the important open problems very well. Um, I think I would complement that by saying that I think so. Those are fundamental questions on the technical front, and we as a group, and me personally, we are very much interested in understanding and resolving some of these limitations that have to do with interpretability, with fairness, with uncertainty quantification, and different aspects that makes machine learning use more responsibly in sensitive applications. But at the same time, I also think that there are an incredible number of very important questions that sit at the intersection of regulation and policy and machine learning, and in particular, healthcare. I am not an expert on policy, and I do not work on this space, but I do understand that there are some very important limitations about the way that current regulatory frameworks address the way that we collect data. And this data is simply crucial to enable the development of further machine learning models. HIPAA compliance guidelines were developed in an age where people were not wearing wearables and collecting biomedical data 24/7 on everybody's wrists. So I think there are very, very important challenges that society will have to come to terms with and just resolve and address for us to move forward. Now, these are not easy questions. These are very complex. They involve a number of players on a different domains and from different scientific backgrounds. And so it's even perhaps more complicated than the technical challenges that Jacopo was describing before. They necessarily involve people coming together and trying to understand each other and trying to find compromises between what we can and we cannot do. And of course, these solutions need to be very careful in making sure that all of the society is well represented and is well taken care of.
I've actually got one question maybe to close our time here on that note. Jeremias, we've been talking a lot about the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration, but maybe for our clinical radiologists out there who are looking for technical collaborators, do you have any maybe quick advice on how to best approach someone on your end? I think that's something I commonly hear is, I want to work with an engineering faculty, but I don't even know where to start. So I'm curious if you have any tips of the trade.
That is a very good question for which, unfortunately, I do not have an answer, I don't think. I have been incredibly lucky to be in a setting at Hopkins in which interdisciplinary research happens very organically, and it is stimulated by the leadership of the university. And so with that context, it's very natural for these collaborations to emerge. If that were not the case, I think that a potentially good resource is meeting people in scientific conferences. So like Jacopo was saying, us going to the RSNA meeting, it was fantastic because we ended up talking and meeting a whole new set of people that we would have never interacted with if we had stayed in our settings, in our conferences, in our smaller world. And so likewise, for someone working in radiology, going perhaps to these other conferences where perhaps it's not just full of radiologists, but perhaps full of engineers and perhaps even full of applied mathematicians who could potentially be interested in understanding more about all these fascinating problems that you have in radiology. I think that would be perhaps my 2 cents and recommendation.
All right, well said. Well, thanks again, Jacopo and Jeremias, for joining us here on an episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence podcast. It's been a lot of fun talking to you about Jacopo's recent work at the RSNA, the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration, and some of the problems ahead that lie at the intersection of ML and diagnostic imaging. So I just want to say thanks again, and it's been a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Paul and Ali and all of the team for the invitation.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks for joining us for both parts of this episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Check out the latest articles from our panelists and others at the Radiology AI website.
We hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence podcast. Shout out to Uriah Shemchisen for our podcast music and to the RSNA podcast staff.
Email us at podcast@rsna.org anytime with questions, feedback, or suggestions.